Hello, I'm Steve Sedgwick, and welcome to CNBC's Internet of Things Powering the Digital Economy debate. Our conversation today is all about addressing value chain emissions. Following last year's COP26, we'll be looking at whether the rate at which corporations are adopting net zero targets is enough to help meet global climate goals. We'll explore value chains and the nature of indirect emissions which occur across them. Known as Scope 3 emissions, what strategies can companies employ to measure and manage them, especially since limiting them looks set to play a pivotal role in hitting their net zero targets? And are companies being transparent enough about their emissions, or is greater reporting and regulation necessary? I'm going to be joined a little bit later on by a panel of leading industry figures to debate these topics. But first, I'm joined by the chairman and CEO of Schneider Electric, Jean-Pascal Tricoire, for a brief discussion that will set the scene for our debate. Jean-Pascal, very good to see you as ever. Happy New Year to you. Look, let's just go back a month or so if we can before we get into this conversation. COP26 was billed as an absolutely pivotal moment for corporations, for governments, for society as a whole. Specifically talking about corporations and businesses, did COP26 deliver? Has it set the foundations in place for a more sustainable corporate world?
Look, COP26, you can say a lot of things, but again, when I look all in all, there's been a lot of commitments taken by governments and more so by companies. And we can say that companies are part of carbon emissions in the world. They are a percentage of the carbon emission of the world, but they are 100% of the solution with technology. So we feel responsible. Many companies and more companies in the world, we are putting together solutions. We are collaborating across companies to make that reduction possible. And I think the world, at the end of the day, whatever we feel frustrated, we need to do 3 times more, 3 times faster, if you put the figures together. But somewhere there is a strong momentum in trying to find solutions.
There is a strong momentum, but I would say there's a lot more that needs doing, if I may. I saw this great stat that over 20% of companies now have their net zero plans in place. But that also leaves an enormous number of companies that don't have net zero plans in place. What more has got to happen to get those companies on board?
Look, what we need to do and what is happening, in fact, is that those companies which have started to put together a plan are bringing together their partners, their suppliers, their integrators, people, their ecosystem. So you've got this tip of the iceberg of people taking strong commitments, but take the example of Schneider. Our own carbon footprint, Scope 1 and Scope 2, is less than 0.5% of the total carbon footprint that we need to address. So take our example. We bring every year 100 million tons of carbon saving for our customers through our solutions. We've last year started an operation with our suppliers to help our 1,000 key strategic suppliers to cut their carbon emission by a factor of 2 in the next coming 5 years. And the good news is that there are technologies that allow to do that. Digital, of course, is one, where everybody should start by measuring what is the carbon footprint. Creating platform like we do at Schneider. We've done with our suppliers that platform where they can converge and work together. And we know that what we're going to do in the next 10 years is much more important than what we're going to do in the following 20 years. So it's 3 times more, 3 times faster.
One thing that was very apparent up in Glasgow, that there are acronyms galore, science-based targets, all kinds of different targets. Everyone's got their own target as well. How verifiable are Scope 3 targets? Because unless we can hold people's feet to the fire accurately, then it's going to be very, very difficult to see who's doing what.
What we see is that companies who are engaged into that direction are measuring, and they are using tools. Schneider is providing some of those tools to reposition all of those emissions, resources, consumptions, which makes it, well, much easier and possible to audit and to verify. In our case, we've been working on that for the past 15 years, and we now audit our extra financials as we audit our financials. So you're going to see more of that. And by the way, investors are now holding us responsible for not only our financials, but also our extra financials. And there is a difference of valuation between companies that just publish what they used to publish and companies that publish a more holistic view of their performance, including of those financials and those extra financials.
Do we need more regulation from governments over scope 1, 2, and of course, for this conversation, scope 3 emissions?
And I'm not sure we need even more regulation in a world which is already very regulated. But there are things that would help. I mean, if I know that we've been talking about that for many years, but a more solid, predictable price of carbon would, of course, help. A carbon leak system at the borders of big regions would help, right? Also.
No, I was just going to say, if it's not regulation from government necessarily needed, but we need help on things such as carbon prices, is it up to companies such as yourself, such as Schneider Electric, to go themselves and be punitive against, and we've talked about this with ecosystems before, but with partners who are just not changing their emission structure? Do you need to drop those partners? Are you prepared to do that?
Yes, and this is what we do. I mean, when we take ourselves strong commitments to carbon neutrality, being carbon neutrality on our scope by 2025, and being carbon neutral by 2040, including the scope 3, it's clear that when we speak to partners today, suppliers of Schneider, and we are a large company buying a lot of things from third-party companies, if you want your company to stay competitive and to work with companies like Schneider, of course, you have to be yourself working on a trajectory to carbon neutrality. But I think it's going to be even more distinctive for talents. We are living in a world where the economy is good, which is great news. Of course, there are issues, supply chain, inflation, and so on. But the biggest shortage probably coming in the future will be talents and people. And people won't want to work with companies who don't go into the right direction for a solution to climate change.
Yeah, and just looking back at the pandemic, which hopefully we're on the tail end of now, we keep saying hopefully, but digitization became a key tool and a key asset for those who were moving down that path quickly as well. Does digitization hold part of the key for reducing those scope 3 emissions at a much quicker time frame?
Yes, because at the end of the day, all of this is about data, understanding what you do, what you produce, what you emit. And digitization is the only thing that connects everything end to end. In the energy field like ours, it connects everything from plant to plug, if it is a renewable plant, to every usage of energy. And the only way to go to a new world, to the world of energy 4.0 or electricity 4.0, because we are speaking about electricity here as the energy of the future, it's really to make sure that we replace the sources which are carbon emitting by low carbon emission sources, and then we share better energy and we save better energy. And digital is a way to do it, because digital allows you to optimize the consumption of energy to the usage of it and to the green and clean production of it.
Final question. Where are you finding the biggest challenges in reducing your scope 3 emissions? What's next, the most important target for Schneider Electric in this arena?
It's really connecting the dots between each layer of the supply chain. I think the world is today realizing the importance and the strategic importance of supply chain, not only for emissions, but also for the tensions which are existing today. And I believe that all industrial companies today are revisiting their supply chain, and it's a great moment to be doing it. And that will be a key element of competitiveness for all of us. Would it be in sustainability, but also in terms of economics?
Jean-Pascal Tricoire, thank you very much indeed, as ever, for your time and for setting the scene for our debate ahead.
Thank you, Steve.
Our panelists are just about to join me, but before I introduce today's guest, here's a short film to frame the debate and add a little more context.
Today, more than 1/5 of the world's largest companies have set net zero emissions targets. Not just because it's the right thing to do for the environment, but in many cases because it makes sense for their bottom line.
At the COP26 summit in Glasgow, nearly 200 countries came together to reduce global greenhouse emissions. However, many climate experts believe these nationally determined contributions will not be enough to prevent global temperatures from rising by 1.5 degrees over the next decade. Many governments plan to revisit their emissions targets in 2022, but more action will be needed to stem the rise of temperatures.
We cannot even stop one day. We have to continue to work very hard. So now we've said 1.5 is still within reach, but for that to happen, these national determined contributions need to increase between now and next year. That's a lot of homework for a lot of countries.
The biggest variable remains the private sector. At least 1/5 of the 2,000 largest publicly listed companies in the world have committed to be net zero by mid-century. However, while corporate announcements capture headlines, what remains a grey area is how we measure and rate a plan as successful or not. Many corporates rely on a global web of suppliers who themselves contribute to global carbon emissions. A supply chain's emissions are often seen as indirect and are not considered part of a corporate's carbon footprint, leaving room for inaccurate reporting and even greenwashing. Indirect emissions released by value chains are known as Scope 3 emissions and can often account for the majority of a company's carbon footprint. And improving value chain efficiency can present unique and complex challenges. Industry needs to re-evaluate the impact of systems such as production and transportation of raw materials, the use of their products, and even their own employees' commuting habits.
I think every major business was tested by COVID, where planning became less important than speed of response. And I think the same is going to be true on the challenges to our supply chain that come from climate change. Resilience, adaptability.
So how can the private sector adopt the best strategy in order to do their part alongside the national targets set by governments? What are the main challenges preventing businesses from reaching these targets, and how can they be overcome? Welcome to CNBC's IOT, Powering the Digital Economy Debate, as we focus on addressing value chain emissions.
Well, joining me now for what looks to be an extremely valuable debate are Judy Kuszewski, Chief Executive of Sancroft International, Daniel Schmid, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer at SAP, and Jos Delbeke, EIB Climate Chair at the European University Institute, and of course, former Director General for Climate Action at the European Commission. Thank you all for joining me. Look, I'm very excited about this panel as well, but we've got some big questions to ask and some big questions to answer. Jos, if I can start off with you in what is a strangely sunny Brussels as well. I had the privilege of speaking to Mr. Timmermans many times before and during COP26. Do you think, though, from a European perspective, enough was achieved at COP26 to lay the foundations, to lay the platform for meaningful moves towards sustainability and net zero?
Well, the COP26 is, like always, a glass that is half full or half empty. A lot more was expected, but what was delivered was really spectacular. We moved through pledges made by countries from a world leading us to 3 degrees warming to a world where we are now having 2 degrees warming. That's not yet good enough, according to what scientists say. But 1 degree Celsius of difference makes a hell of a difference. And what is even more important is that difficult negotiations in the past showed that countries like the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Russia, these were always very difficult countries to get pledges from, let alone India or China or the United States for a change, because the United States is now back in the Paris Agreement circle. We have seen lots of commitments. So that's basically good news. It is not yet the 1.5 degrees Celsius as scientists are telling us we should get at, but it is a major change.
Judy, sometimes I look at it and I look at the enormous progress that was made between COP21 in Paris, where I was at 6 years ago, and indeed what I saw at Glasgow for COP26. And I thought, great, corporates have moved ahead regardless. And then I look at the number of corporates who are nowhere near giving us net zero pledges. What are your thoughts on specifically what corporations have done, haven't done, and have pledged to do?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that we very rarely ask the business community or individual businesses to make promises towards a goal where the path to get there may not be entirely clear. This is actually a very rare exception, and the fact that there have been quite a few early adopters of net zero pledges and targets towards meeting those net zero pledges, they've been especially bold to take that kind of slight leap into the unknown. Having said that, this is really an area where all businesses must get a grip, as quickly as possible. I would say that it was clear in Glasgow that the business community was visible and active in a way that it had not previously been in earlier COPs. We see a lot of action from business in calling for a level playing field, for bold commitments, and for a framework that they know they can operate within. So I think it's a mixed bag, but there's a lot of reason to be hopeful about the progress.
I just would like to add here one thought. I would say it depends on the maturity level the company is in, and I differentiate 3 levels. One is, we would need to be compliant and seeing that topic as a risk perspective, and then they look at the regulation, But the companies being more mature already see the beauty and elements of the business case. So if you reduce your energy consumption by being more efficient, you of course reduce your emissions, but as well you have a better, you have your costs better under control. And then there's this third level who see not only that responsibility coming with it, but seeing it as well as an opportunity and transforming their products, their services, or even their business models. So that depends here on which maturity level the company is.
When you talk about maturity levels, we can look at this in 2 ways. We can look at, say, an 18-year-old child who is immature, or we can look at a very young company that needs to grow as well. So are we talking about maturity in terms of attitudes, or maturity in terms of the scale of where the company is at? And of course, many small and medium-sized entities do not have the same luxuries as an SAP in this world. So are we talking about maturity in attitude or maturity in the development of the company itself?
No, maturity in attitude and understanding the holistic view on sustainability with these various dimensions, the environmental, the economic, and the social dimension, and how these are linked to each other. And coming from that thought, there's either no business or sustainable business. That is my true belief for the future to come. And that is not depending on the size of the company or how old the company is. And even I would say quite often the bigger companies who think more towards quarterly performance can learn from smaller companies who think more in generations of the owners.
Gosh, you've said so much. I want to get everyone back involved on this. Jos, I'll come back to you in a moment. Judy, you have been in this business, doing this for a long, long time as well. And I still see the same debates from those who want shareholder value, not stakeholder value, from those who want to obsess about quarterly performances compared with what Daniel was speaking about there. How does that transformation look to you, Judy?
So one of the most exciting and most perhaps unexpected developments that we've seen in the last couple of years or so is that climate change is actually a topic that investors are looking carefully at right now, really asking questions about the company strategy and their future fitness to deal with the inevitable changes that are ahead of us, the inevitable policy responses that must come and will come and are coming around the world. How are businesses aligning their business models and understanding the risk and opportunity at a very deep level and preparing to change, to adapt to this future situation?
Jos, come in here, sir.
Well, I think that the pressure that originally came towards the public authorities has now, since Paris, gradually widened up to involve the private sector, and in particular, the dealing with risk and looking for opportunities. I think that's a very important 2 elements to mention. And I would say there is a lot of work ahead of us, because the risk that we are also running is that the general public that is pressurizing the politicians as much as the private sector is very wary of greenwashing. And I think we have this trust that is now being expressed towards the public and the private sector. We have to nurture that, because greenwashing may give us a backlash. And I think that is a lot of what is at stake here, that companies going for net zero can demonstrate in a very credible manner that they are going to net zero. Like, for example, in the public sector, in the emissions trading system of the EU, the monitoring and the compliance was terribly important to create a trust in the system. It's good to have a concept of putting a price on carbon, but is it credibly done, is what the general public is asking.
Yeah, I think we've laid the foundation beautifully, and we could carry on in this vein for a long time. I want to specifically move on, if I may, to value chains and a scope 3 as well. Jos, let me start off with you again there as well. What has the European plan, what has COP26 more generally done to improve all aspects of scope 3, the indirect emissions, the difficult part, the challenging part of any corporation's emissions?
Well, the EU has already come forward with the regulation that is now being rolled out. The Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation is already operational. There is a slight delay in the implementation, with the year 24 is going to be an important year. But also for corporates in the industrial sector, there is legislation on the table that is currently is negotiated. And COP26 was a major impetus, to speed up the work. As was said before, it's not only industry, but the financial sector is coming on board, and doing that in a credible manner is terribly important. But there is a shortage of data, and there is a shortage of reliable data. And so we are seeing the start now of a journey where we all have to learn a lot, and we will all have to compare notes with one another. And so we will have to have a joint effort from companies, from the auditing sector, from the scrutiny, from the oversight bodies, to get started on the journey and to minimize the fallout in terms of mistakes that we unavoidably are going to make.
So many important points, and I hadn't even thought about the role of the auditing sector, which quite frankly hasn't covered itself in glory in all cases on normal financial reporting, let alone in reporting on sustainability. Judy, I'm going to come to you in a few moments' time about some of those issues, about bespoke solutions compared with generalized standards, science-based standards as well. But if I may come to you, Daniel, as well. You've been writing in mid-January about what SAP is doing to improve its performance on Scope 3, what it needs to do next as well. Why don't you share with our viewers a little bit about what SAP is doing?
Let me one aspect to the conversation before, because I believe it's quite interesting for our audience, is on the movement in the capital markets. Just to underpin that with numbers, back 10 years, we had 5 to 6% of the share of institutional investors being invested in SAP shares coming from the socially responsible investor niche, I would say. Now, this number is 38.2%. And the mainstream investors learn from that socially responsible investors. It makes such a lot of sense to consider as well non-financial indicators in order to better judge the future value of the company. Now back to your question with regard to our announcement we just made about being net zero by 2030. Originally, this was to be net zero by 2050. And in our case, celebrating this year now the 50th birthday of SAP means we have a lot of customers using our solutions in an on-premise way, meaning they run their servers on their own premises and not in our data centers or in our partner locations. And that counts for 85% of our entire value chain emissions. And the movement towards the cloud and the transformation towards the cloud and the offering from our side since 2014 that all our cloud solutions are offered by a green cloud, meaning 100% renewables of high quality, that will help us to achieve that. But by having such a bold ambition, we start to think differently, we will be innovative and creative, we will allocate budgets in a different way.
Let me move on to Judy on this point as well. Judy, your whole business is about creating bespoke solutions, but what Jos was talking about there as well is having solutions that avoid greenwash ambiguity as well. Does bespoke lend itself to actually creating opacity rather than verifiable standards on a uniform basis?
Well, that's a great question, and I think for us, for our business and for our clients, I mean, the solutions that we put in place and the strategies that we help them to define and to implement on sustainability topics and performance have to be fit for purpose for the specific business, because no two companies are exactly alike, and that's as it should be. Having said that, you're absolutely right that there must be the fundamental, the foundations of these strategies must be built on clearly identified, globally accepted, consistent, reliable, transparent methodologies, especially where it concerns something as important as this issue. And there is a lot of difficulty around this, especially where we're talking about scope 3. Its greatest strength is its flexibility, which, as I say, is as it should be, because the accounting for scope 3 needs to reflect the business as it actually is. On the other hand, that flexibility is exactly what enables a degree of subjectivity and cherry picking. It's just an imperfect, kind of methodology. We don't have the perfect methodologies at the moment, but the transparency of this process of measuring, disclosing, and managing against the performance that you can demonstrate. That transparency needs to be really clear and high and authentic, so that it reduces the level of distrust, the level of unreliability, and the level of just, as I say, cherry picking.
To all of you, and I'll ask it to all of you, I have acronym fatigue. How can you tell me already that we don't have verifiable standards, whether it's a UN science-based target or it's MSCI? Mr. Fernandez there was telling me we have great standards for measuring all companies about their aspirations across the board. How can we not have, by now, when it's very important to have verifiable standards, how can we not have uniform standards? Wasn't that clearly an important goal of COP26, Judy?
We do have uniform standards. They're just not consistently applied. And I think this is one of the real problems here. So there isn't really a need for new standards. There's a need for consistent application of the standards that we already have, whether those are around sustainability reporting and indicators. Far and away the most used one is the Global Reporting Initiative, which is used by 10,000 companies annually. It incorporates the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, by the way, which is what defines scopes 1, 2, and 3, and so forth. There is good agreement across the landscape about what the frameworks and the measurement protocols should be. It's about application. And when you're talking about scope 3, it's simply the complexity of what could be in the value chain, which it means that every company draws their boundary in a different way. If we can get more transparency around that, and if we can get more challenge as to the decisions that organizations make about what to disclose, what not to disclose, we will improve that level of consistency and reliability.
Jos, by the time we get down to scope 3 in the annual report from companies as well, we're in some real long weeds there as well. Is it just way too complex to get verifiable standards down to scope 3 when, as Daniel has said, and I'm sure he's going to say again, the complexities of going upstream and downstream in your value chain, that's pretty tough?
It's pretty tough, I would agree. And I'm somewhat less optimistic as the process described by Judy. Indeed, there is a lot of information out there, but there are still competing standards and there are still loose ends that are more important than what you would think at first sight. Because basically, scope 1 is a direct emissions coming out of the chimney. You can measure that very well. Scope 2 is the emissions related to electricity consumption. That is also quite verifiable because electricity, we manage that well. But scope 3 are all the products and services that companies are using, and these may be way beyond what their scope 1 and 2 emissions are. And I think there are many different ways of doing that, and it's very complicated. If everybody were to use the direct emission standard all over the world, we would not bother about scope 2 and scope 3, then everything would be covered. But that's not the reality of the world. And I think we are in a learning process. And I would hope that oversight bodies and auditing companies can, who have access to confidential information, can compare notes in a proactive manner so as to make sure that the entire exercise is credible and is credible in the eyes of the general public. And then we may prevent going too much in a regulatory sense. And I think that is where Europeans are always, looking for regulation first, instead of what self-regulation can bring us. So the interplay between the two is going to be a very important one. And the more the private sector can bring its act together in a reliable manner, the less the public authorities will, I hope, have a temptation to regulate, and some would say over-regulate, what needs to be proven.
Yeah, it's a European illness, isn't it, in some ways? Daniel, you specifically addressed this issue. I've got the copy in front of me. The challenge will increase the more we move upstream and downstream into our value chain. You're talking about additional complexity as you focus further in different areas of sustainability. I think you share with Jost your concerns that this is going to be tough.
Definitely, it's tough, but I'm optimistic as well. One aspect is, of course, standardization. That is the foundation we need in applying these standards consistently, because at the end, it's about having the data in your hands where you trust in the data. And that is what many peers share with me from other companies. Daniel, I have that issue. I don't have the data in my hands in a consistent way where I trust the data at the time of the decision in order to manage my business holistically and manage that performance, and not just fulfilling reporting purposes of other stakeholders. And for that, you see, that is clearly an expectation from the market to us, from SAP, and we are uniquely positioned because with our systems, we manage the business processes. Now embedding sustainability criteria like greenhouse gas emissions, but there are many others as well, in these business processes, in the data models that allow the decision makers in the companies to have the data at the point of the decision in their hands. And there, of course, you need to hide the complexity because you need to connect data from own SAP systems, but as well from third-party providers, from other systems being used and operated in these companies. So that is the complexity. And we, with our technology, need to hide that in front of the user of these data and ensure that it's shared across the various players, the partners, the suppliers.
Let me come back to this because I can see Jos nodding, I can see Judy as well, but I'm actually quite excited about something you said, but I would add the word digitization to data as well, because I know as part of your Fit for 55 plan, Jos, from speaking to you, from speaking to your colleagues as well, actually, digitization goes hand in hand with the race to net zero, for the race to understand what's going on the scope 3 as well. Technological solutions are there, aren't they, sir?
Absolutely. And we have not yet taken the habit from the climate policy perspective to welcome all these new developments on the technology field that are out there. Digitalization is very important for data management. Absolutely, it goes without saying. But also in the energy sector, optimizing the use of energy. And, the digitalization is only at the beginning of showing its contribution potentially to greening the information streams, but also the greening the policies that corporations are developing. So fully in line with what you have been saying here.
And let me add one aspect, because it's not just about energy emissions. It is well about the movement towards circular economy, which is a 45 positive contribution to bring down greenhouse gas emissions based on a study from the Al MacArthur Foundation.
Judy, please.
What I'd like to say at this point is that we've talked a lot about the complexity of scope 3 and of reaching net zero targets in general, and a lot of the technological solutions. But the fact of this complexity very often puts companies off doing things. They say, oh, it's just so difficult. I don't know. I have to wait until this perfect technological solution arrives and then I can act on it. We can't hide behind complexity to avoid doing something better than we're doing right now. And the thing I want to say here now is that regardless of all of these other solutions that are in the offing and that are coming down the pipeline, there are many, many levers that companies can move today to make a real difference to the climate change performance of their value chains that will make a difference today. We may not have perfect measurement around what it is, but we can still take action. And if we're going to hit a net zero vision in 2050, we have to take all the action that we can today.
So it's your job, Judy, because you've been doing this for a quarter of a century, to look at those complexities, to look at those arguments for companies who don't want to do this and say, no, there is a simple path to this. So I have a simple question for you. Give me your best example of some of those levers that aren't being used that can be used to get to where we need to at 2030.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot that companies can do. The first set of recommendations that I would say has to do with supply chain engagement, engaging with your suppliers to really understand specifically what are the challenges and barriers that they face in terms of energy efficiency, carbon emissions, and renewables substitution, and so forth. A really big one could be access to finance, particularly if companies are sourcing from low and middle income countries. Some of the changes necessary to upgrade equipment or to transform processes or so forth, they may not actually be all that expensive, but traditional finance may not be available to the suppliers who need it. Another one just has to do with the internal activities around incentivizing performance, making sure that your procurement teams are clear about what your own ambitions and targets are as a business and why, and that they know what the tools are that they have available to them to have those conversations around procurement, so that it doesn't come as a surprise to anyone.
Very important topic you're addressing with the supply chain and how to engage with the suppliers. I would say from my own experience, it should always be in parallel. You need to have quite bold ambitions and activities internally in your own operations. Otherwise, it could be perceived, oh, sustainability is now delegated to the suppliers. They need to change. They need to transform. But I lean back and don't do anything, yeah, and that needs to go hand in hand and in parallel, I would say. Otherwise, it's not so credible.
Absolutely agree. It's really important to set a good example and to tackle the emissions that are within your direct control as far as it is possible to do so. Absolutely agree.
Yes.
I think this is an important conversation, but I wanted to come back to some of the points that Judy made earlier, and that is the complexity and hiding behind the complexity. And of course, that should not be the attitude. Yeah, let's not be misunderstood on that. But let's face it, there is going to be a lot of scrutiny by the general public, because the net zero affichage by major corporations is sometimes, being close to misleading the public, because you have companies who are far away from net zero and trumpet that they are going to be net zero almost overnight. And the second element I think I would underline is it's good to have both a short-term and a long-term strategy. The two have to fit together, because it's easy to say we are going to be net zero by 2050 and not doing anything today.
What are the thorniest issues here? We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. I mean, is it just basically down to energy again and the costs of the consumption of that energy on the value chain? Judy, why don't you answer that?
Yeah, I think there's, it's myriad. And I would say that one of the biggest thorniest issues is the lack of a level playing field across jurisdictions, within industries and across industries. There are some industries that have just been given a complete free ride, really, as far as climate change is concerned. In respect of healthcare, for example, we would have at this point, almost certainly we would have eliminated HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, which is a highly potent greenhouse gas. If it had not been for the fact that they are used as a propellant in asthma inhalers. It's one of the sort of the few applications that we've simply not been able to get over that hurdle. We do have alternatives. We just haven't insisted that they be applied. The reason why COP26 and why all of these big international agreements are so important is because it's essential to set that level playing field and consistent expectations all across society and businesses, so that we can hold to account the laggards and we can support the good progress in respect of the global best practices.
Jos?
Well,
Biggest
your
challenges?
question was, where is the bulk? And I would say the bulk that needs to be addressed is the fossil fuel use in one way or the other, directly or indirectly. That's the bulk. There we have methane emissions and HCFC emissions, etc. But if we would start looking already in a thorough manner to everywhere fossil fuels, that is oil, gas, coal, is being used in a direct or indirect way to transportation, through electricity generation, etc., we would already catch perhaps 80 to 90% of the equation. So I would put a lot of emphasis there and start building further on many of the standards that have already been developed by the private sector or have directly or indirectly being used by public sector. In the state aid provisions in Europe, for example, they have lots of implicit criteria that could be used as well and on which a common standard could be based. So a long journey, but a fascinating journey. And it is, there is no way out. We have to go this journey.
And Daniel?
In addition to the energy, I would like to emphasize again the circular economy topic, that there's an urgent movement needed. And that leads, by the way, to a lot of innovation. For me, sustainability is always a very strong innovation driver. And here you see as well, we need to overcome industry boundaries. We need to share data and networks. Just think about the very simple topic of the packaging of consumer goods. You need to bring together the consumer brands with the retailers, with the waste management companies, with the chemical companies in order to change.
I have time for one last question, of which I'll ask you if you can keep your answers fairly short as well. Where is the lowest hanging fruit, the easiest to attain goals in order to help move on our progress towards sustainability on scope 3 emissions specifically? Where is the lowest hanging fruit that we can actually find the benefits as well?
Really straightforward efficiency. And it is something that almost every business can partner with their supply chain to improve access to energy efficient technologies, which can be as simple as lighting solutions or as complex as much more sophisticated energy systems. But efficiency is an underpraised method of dealing with this.
Daniel?
Efficiency is super important. We need to do things differently, otherwise we will not solve today's challenges. So for me, just applying the learnings from the pandemic, in our case, seeing that people work now from home, less emissions caused by commuting, less business travel, not sitting always in a plane, and moving back to not to the old normal, but to a new normal of a hybrid world, like we have that engaged panel with all of you in a virtual setup. That should be the new normal, and that is clearly a quick win.
And Jos?
I would agree. Efficiency, transport, minimizing, is very important. But I would add to that, let's look at coal and lignite. In the value chain, there are lots of goods and products still used with a lot of coal. And I think coal is the primary, source of energy that is creating the headache for climate, not only today, but for the next and coming decade. We have to address coal upfront, and I hope that the value chain discussions could, indicate where and create pressures to move away from this source of energy and electricity generation.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from timescales for emission reductions to regulation, from where the biggest value chain challenges lie to verifiable Scope 3 standards, and plenty more besides. Once again, I would like to thank our panelists, Judy Kuszewski, Chief Executive of Sancroft International, Daniel Schmid, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer at SAP, and Jos Delbeke, EIB Climate Chair at the European University Institute and former Director General for Climate Action at the European Commission. Thank you very much again for what I believe has been an insightful look into the demand for addressing value chain emissions.